To get this episode of Forensic Tales ad-free, please visit patreon.com/Forensic Tales.
Forensic Tales discusses topics that some listeners may find disturbing. The contents of this episode may not be suitable for everyone. Listener discretion is advised.
On Memorial Day weekend in 2004, a young girl in Fort Wayne, Indiana, found a plastic bag attached to her bicycle. Inside was a handwritten note, a disturbing photograph, and a sample of the writer's own DNA. He claimed he had been watching her and threatened to hurt her if she went to the police. But then he made an even more terrifying claim. He said he was the same person who had kidnapped and murdered 8-year-old April Tinsley 16 years earlier. Similar packages were soon discovered outside the homes of other young girls. For years, police had possessed DNA from April's killer, but every database search had come up empty. Now, the person claiming responsibility had intentionally given them even more. Testing confirmed that the DNA from the packages matched the evidence recovered after April's murder in 1988. So how did a murderer who practically identified himself and handed police the evidence to prove it remain unidentified for another 14 years? This is Forensic Tales, episode 348, The Murder of April Tinsley. Welcome to Forensic Tales. I'm your host, Courtney Fretwell. Forensic Tales is a weekly true crime podcast with a forensic twist. Each episode features real stories highlighting how forensic science was used to uncover the truth. If you enjoy deep dives into real cases and the science behind them, make sure you're subscribed so you never miss an episode. And if you want even more content, including monthly full-length bonus episodes and early ad-free access to over 300 episodes, you can join our community over on Patreon. The support there truly helps keep the show going. To learn more, visit patreon.com/Forensic Tales. And one small favor that makes a huge difference for the show. If you're enjoying Forensic Tales, please consider leaving a positive review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. It really helps other listeners discover the podcast. The little girl at the heart of this tragic story is 8-year-old April Tinsley. And as with every victim's story we cover on the podcast, they deserve to be remembered for who they were when they were alive, not just for how they were killed. And while there isn't much publicly available information about April's short life, here's what I was able to learn about her. She was born on March 18th, 1980, and lived with her parents, Janet and Michael, and baby brother in Fort Wayne, Indiana. In the upper right corner of Indiana, just 18 miles from the Ohio border, Fort Wayne sits on a subtle continental divide that cuts through the heart of the American Midwest. Throughout almost every article I came across, April was described as a cheerful but somewhat shy little girl with blonde hair and a small, almost mischievous smile. In the spring of 1988, April was in the second grade at Fairfield Elementary School. And like any other kid her age, her days were probably filled with the simple magic of learning cursive, reading aloud in class, and counting down the weeks until summer vacation. She also kept busy by singing in the children's choir at Faith United Methodist Church. She and her family lived on Hoagland Avenue in a close-knit neighborhood where children regularly walked back and forth between one another's houses. They played outside, visited friends nearby, and came home when it was time for dinner. It was the kind of freedom that felt completely normal at the time, especially in a neighborhood where families knew one another. By April of that year, she had just celebrated her 8th birthday, and should have had an entire childhood still ahead of her. More birthdays, more school years, and countless ordinary moments with her family and friends. Today, April is still remembered throughout Fort Wayne. A memorial garden was created in her neighborhood, and a tree and bench were dedicated to her at Fairfield Elementary, ensuring that she is remembered not only for what happened to her, but as the cheerful, shy 8-year-old girl she was. April 1st, 1988 was a Friday, but school hallways across Indiana were entirely empty. Because it was Good Friday, children like April Tinsley were given a 3-day holiday weekend, a cruel twist of timing for a date usually reserved for harmless April Fool's jokes. After a cold morning, the weather cleared enough by early afternoon for April to ask her mom if she could play with her friend Nicole, who lived only a few blocks away on West Suttonfield Street. And since she had walked to and from Nicole's house by herself many times in the past, Janet didn't hesitate to say yes. The only thing she asked was that she call her as soon as she got to Nicole's house safely. Before heading out the door, Janet handed April an umbrella because it was supposed to rain later that afternoon. Then after that, April called from Nicole's house to say she made it safely. But before hanging up, Janet reminded her to be home by 4 o'clock that afternoon before the storm got too bad. When 4 o'clock came and went and she still hadn't returned home, Janet called Nicole's house to see if she knew where she was. Nicole explained that she and April had spent most of the afternoon playing with dolls and talking excitedly about all the chocolate they were hoping to get for Easter. Later, they walked to a nearby playground about halfway between their houses and met up with another friend. A little after 3 o'clock, the 3 girls left the playground and started walking toward that friend's house. But along the way, it began to drizzle, and April realized she had left her umbrella back at Nicole's. So she told the other girls she was going to run back and get it while they continued on without her. When she never showed up at their friend's house, Nicole assumed she'd changed her mind and gone home instead. But April hadn't gone home. And when Nicole's mother told Janet that April had never returned for the umbrella either, she immediately knew something was wrong. Janet's next move was to tell Michael, and together they started walking the neighborhood streets looking for her. But when 6 o'clock came around and there still wasn't any sign of her, that's when they decided it was time to report her missing to the Fort Wayne Police Department. As soon as the police officers arrived at the Tinsley home, they started the official search for her and began tracing her last known movements. They were also given a description of what April was wearing that day: a blue turtleneck sweater with a pink and red jacket over it, light blue pants with 3 love hearts down one leg, and pink gym shoes. So with her picture in hand, the police started canvassing the neighborhood and speaking with everyone who lived there. But when that search turned empty, they expanded it to the more rural outskirts of Fort Wayne. It didn't take long for dozens of volunteers to join the police and help look for April. At this point, everyone hoped she had simply gotten lost or was maybe hiding somewhere nearby. After all, it was April Fool's Day, and one of her favorite games was hide and seek. But as news of her disappearance spread, a witness came forward with information that completely changed the direction of the search. The witness said they had seen a little girl walking along Hoagland Avenue, the street that led toward April's house, around the same time she disappeared. And as the girl crossed the street, a blue pickup pulled up beside her. The driver briefly spoke to the girl, and when the pickup drove away, the witness noticed that she was gone. But at the time, nothing about the interaction seemed suspicious. There were no screams and no obvious signs of a struggle, so the witness assumed the driver was probably the girl's father or uncle. But when they described what the girl had been wearing, especially the light blue pants with several distinctive hearts running down one leg, police were confident the girl they had seen was April. The witness described the driver as a white man in his 30s with wavy, sandy-colored hair and a slight beard. But beyond that basic description, no one knew who he was. And suddenly, this no longer looked like a little girl who had wandered too far from home or hidden somewhere as part of a game. If the witness was right, April had been approached by a stranger, persuaded or forced into his truck, and driven away from the neighborhood before anyone even realized she was missing. She had likely been abducted in broad daylight, just a short distance from her own home.
Meet Keith, loving dad, board game champ, bus driving pro.
I drive 65,000 miles in my bus each year. If people knew what I know, lives could be saved. Like how there are some things I simply can't see. On my route the other day, a car tried to sneak past me and ends up right in my blind spot. I turned slowly, so accident avoided. But no car should be in the blind spot for a 40,000-pound bus. It's our roads. It's our safety.
Visit www.sharetheroadsafely.gov.
That weekend, Easter came and went, with no sign of April. But by the afternoon of Monday, April 4th, the search for her would end in a way no one wanted. A jogger was out running along Road 68 in Spencerville, an unincorporated town about 20 miles from Fort Wayne, when he saw something in a drainage ditch about 40 feet from the main road. It turned out to be the body of April Tinsley. Without going into every horrible detail of her murder, she'd been suffocated and strangled to death. And although she was still wearing the clothes she was last seen alive in, there was strong evidence that her attacker had redressed her after assaulting her. Her pants were on backward, and she was also missing a shoe, which was eventually found on the other side of the road, suggesting her killer had dumped her in the ditch. Then, realizing as he drove away, he still had her other shoe in the car, so he threw it out the window. Then there was the forensic evidence of an assault. Testing on April's underwear came back positive for the presence of semen. And while Fort Wayne detectives knew that this evidence could be important, this was still 1988 when forensic DNA testing was really just beginning. Back then, labs generally needed a much larger and much cleaner sample to create a usable DNA profile. The testing process was also slow, limited, and nowhere near as sensitive as it is today. So even though they had biological evidence that likely came from April's killer, there wasn't much they could actually do with it at the time, but they preserved it. And while that DNA couldn't identify April's killer in 1988, it would eventually become one of the most important pieces of evidence in the entire case. The medical examiner believed April had died sometime within a day or two, and had only been placed in that ditch about 4 hours before her body was discovered. And the location where she was found seemed important as well. This wasn't the kind of place someone would necessarily stumble across by accident. It was rural, isolated, and hidden from passing traffic, which led detectives to believe the killer was probably familiar with the area and knew it would be a good place to leave her body without being seen. But there weren't any immediate or obvious suspects. April was 8 years old. She didn't have enemies or some complicated personal life for investigators to unravel. And there was nothing in the Tinsley family's background that pointed police toward anyone who would want to hurt her. But just when police thought they were heading toward a dead end, they received another tip about a blue pickup truck. This time, near the area where April's body was found. According to the witness, it looked like the same type of truck seen beside April in her neighborhood on the day she disappeared. So police began tracking down blue pickups across Indiana. They looked into thousands of vehicles, but once again, nothing led them to April's killer. Then one name started coming up again and again. Police received more than 100 calls pointing them toward the same local man. And for the very first time, they didn't just have a vague description of a stranger or a common type of truck. They had an actual suspect. He was 34-year-old Everett Shull Jr., a local gang member who went by the nickname Moose. And when the Hoagland Avenue witness was shown a photographic lineup, they identified him as the man they had seen with April. But the connections or suspicion didn't end there. A neighbor told police that a blue pickup had been parked outside Shull's home for several weeks. It didn't actually belong to him, but investigators learned that he may have had access to it through a friend. There were also bizarre stories about his behavior. Shull was reportedly known to hang around local parks and make inappropriate comments about children. And just days before April disappeared, someone claimed they overheard him talking about seeing two young girls and wanting to grab one of them. Because Shull belonged to a gang that was rumored to have an interest in the occult, stories quickly spread that April's murder might have been some kind of ritual sacrifice. But when police looked into that theory, they found nothing to support it. Shull denied having anything to do with April's disappearance or murder. He was questioned for several hours and reportedly passed multiple polygraph tests, although, of course, polygraphs aren't considered reliable proof of innocence or guilt. Detectives also collected DNA samples from Shull and several other potential suspects, but he was ultimately eliminated as April's killer. He was later charged in a separate case involving an 11-year-old girl, but he was acquitted. So despite the witness identification, the blue pickup, and all those calls pointing police toward him, Everett Shull, or Moose as he was better known, wasn't the guy who killed April. As investigators continued working through tips, April's family was left to plan the funeral of their 8-year-old daughter. Her memorial service was held on April 8th at Faith United Methodist Church, the same church where she had sung in the children's choir. More than 150 people reportedly attended, and she was later buried at Green Lawn Memorial Park. The response from the Fort Wayne community was enormous. Local radio stations established a reward fund for information leading to April's killer, while additional donations helped cover her funeral expenses and support her family. But alongside the grief, there was also fear. A child had been taken from her own neighborhood in the middle of the afternoon, and whoever had done it was still out there. Parents who had once allowed their children to walk to a friend's house or play outside suddenly didn't feel comfortable letting them out of their sight. Just a few weeks later, around 90 local residents came together to form a volunteer organization called April, the Associated Parents Regional Independent League, or later Abduction Prevention Reconnaissance and Information League. The group was created to promote child safety and help families searching for missing children. So even as the investigation began to slow down, April's name remained everywhere. For the next 2 years, there was nothing. No new evidence and no real suspects until May of 1990. On May 21st, 1990, police were called to a family barn in St. Joseph Township after a teenage boy reported finding strange messages written on his family's property. Scrawled across the barn in crayon were the words, "I kill 8-year-old April Marie Tinsley," with her last name misspelled. Another message read, "Did you find the other shoe? Haha, I will kill again." Crayons were found nearby, but there was no sign of whoever had written the messages. No fingerprints were found, and the teenage boys never actually saw the guy who wrote it. And the note about the shoe was especially troubling because that was a detail the police had deliberately kept from the public, which meant the person who wrote this likely knew something only investigators and April's killer would know. After 2 years of silence, it appeared April's killer had resurfaced, and now he was threatening to kill again. Just a few weeks later, it looked like he might have followed through on that threat. On June 13th, 7-year-old Sarah Bowker disappeared from her family's apartment complex in Fort Wayne. She had been swimming with her stepsister that afternoon when she left the pool to visit a friend who lived nearby. But she never made it to the friend's apartment, and when she didn't return home for dinner, her family called the police. Sarah was close to April's age, and she had disappeared only 3 weeks after someone claiming to be April's killer threatened to kill again. A police dog eventually tracked Sarah's scent away from the apartment complex and toward Coldwater Road, and along the way, searchers found a stuffed kitten that belonged to her. Then, in a drainage ditch nearby, they found her body. She had been assaulted and suffocated just like April. Given the obvious similarities between the two cases, police had to consider the possibility that April's killer had followed through on his threat. So in April 1991, local and state investigators formed a joint homicide team to investigate the murders together. But after reviewing both cases side by side, the FBI's behavioral science unit ultimately concluded that the girls had most likely been killed by different people. Then years later, forensic evidence discovered after the death of a man named Roy Hensley reportedly connected him to Sarah's murder. So from that point forward, they were satisfied that Hensley had killed Sarah, but they found no evidence tying him to April. Fast forward over a decade to 2004. Over Memorial Day weekend, 4 notes were found in the Fort Wayne area that were believed to have been written by April's murderer. A 7-year-old girl found the first one when she saw a plastic bag in the basket of her little pink bicycle. It contained a used condom and a note claiming to be from April's killer and threatening her that she would become his next victim. When the police were called in to look at the letter, the first thing that stood out was the messy handwriting. Just like in the note that was written across the barn years earlier, the note featured the same misspellings, poor grammar, and punctuation errors. It almost looked like whoever wrote it intentionally tried to throw people off. But that was just the first letter to pop up that weekend. 2 more girls, ages 5 and 9, found similar messages written on lined yellow paper. One had been left inside a basket being used as a flower pot, while another was taped directly to a girl's bicycle. Each letter began with the words, "Hi, honey," and contained the same kinds of misspellings, threats, and repeated ha-has. Even April's name was spelled incorrectly. And with each letter, the writer left what he described as a present, a used condom. They were all tested, and the DNA matched the male profile recovered from April's underwear 16 years earlier. So there was no longer any question that these letters were real. The person leaving them was April's killer. But when investigators searched the profile through state and national DNA databases, nothing came back. Then a 4th one surfaced. This time they found the letter inside a family's mailbox. But unlike the previous 3 letters, it didn't contain a condom. Instead, however, it had a Polaroid photograph showing the naked lower half of a white man as he lay on the bed. As gross and disturbing as the photo was, it also revealed an important clue. The man was lying on a bedspread with a very unique green paisley-type pattern. And at first glance, it looked like the kind of bedspread you might see at a hotel. That idea led the police and FBI to check hundreds of hotels and motels throughout the state, but none had that particular bedding, suggesting the picture might have been taken in the man's own home. The photo put investigators in a difficult position. Publicizing them might generate a lead, but it could also give the killer exactly what his letters suggested he wanted: attention. So the police waited 2 years before releasing portions of the letters, along with a carefully cropped section of one Polaroid showing the distinctive green paisley bedspread behind the man. That led to several more unsuccessful leads coming in, but it also led to something else: more fear. Not only were we looking for April's killer, but clearly this person is out there stalking and targeting other young girls. By 2009, the hunt for April's murderer was over 2 decades old. It was also around this time that the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit created a suspect profile of the man they were looking for. They believed he was a white man who was now somewhere in his 40s or 50s. They described him as a preferential child offender, meaning his interest in young girls was long-term, persistent, and unlikely to simply go away. He could be married, although the FBI noted that most offenders who fit this profile weren't. If he did have a partner, they believed she might already be aware of his inappropriate interest in children, but either didn't understand how serious it was or was in denial about what he was capable of. The killer may have seemed socially awkward around other adults, but investigators believed he would look for ways to get close to children. That could mean choosing a job or volunteer position that gave him access to them, befriending families with young daughters, or spending time in places like playgrounds, parks, and swimming pools. They also believed he had strong ties to northeastern Fort Wayne and Allen County. He likely lived, worked, or regularly shopped there, and was probably familiar with both the neighborhood where April was taken and the rural area where her body was found. Based on the Polaroids and witness reports from 2004, investigators added a few more specific details. He had likely owned or borrowed a Polaroid camera and may have driven a forest green pickup with a matching camper shell and dark-tinted windows. And despite the disturbing things he had done, he may have lived an otherwise completely unremarkable life. He could have been someone people passed at the grocery store, sat near at church, or worked beside every day without ever realizing what he had done. They thought he probably followed the coverage of April's case. The letters made that clear. He wanted people talking about him, and he seemed to enjoy knowing that an entire community was still afraid of what he might do next. In April 2009, April's case was featured on America's Most Wanted. Nearly 50 tips came in after the episode aired, most of them from the Fort Wayne area. But none of those calls led police to April's killer at the time. By 2018, reportedly more than 700 potential suspects had submitted DNA samples, and every single one had been ruled out. It had become an exhausting cycle that never seemed to end. A promising new name would come in, police would obtain the person's DNA, and everyone would wonder if this was finally the break they had been waiting for. But each time, the result was the same: no match. After 30 years, detectives even had to consider the possibility that April's killer had already died, and they were chasing someone who was no longer alive. Thankfully, however, investigators still had forensic evidence to work with. The killer had essentially replenished their supply himself when he left the used condoms with those threatening letters in 2004. So that gave scientists a fresh, strong DNA sample they could continue testing as forensic technology improved. And in 2015, they used it in an entirely new way.
What would you do if your online store converted 36% more shoppers? You could take 36% more vacation.
Another pina colada? Yes, please.
Open a new retail location with 36% more square feet.
Fantastic.
Hire 36% more help.
You're hired and you're hired.
Shopify has the world's best converting checkout, up to 36% better than other e-commerce platforms. What you do with those extra sales is up to you. Switch to Shopify today at shopify.com/listen and get a $1 trial. Shopify.com/listen.
Meet Keith, loving dad, board game champ, bus driving pro.
I drive 65,000 miles in my bus each year. If people knew what I know, lives could be saved. Like how there are some things I simply can't see. On my route the other day, a car tried to sneak past me and ends up right in my blind spot. I turned slowly, so accident avoided. But no car should be in the blind spot for a 40,000-pound bus. It's our roads. It's our safety.
Visit www.sharetheroadsafely.gov.
They sent it to Parabon Nanolabs, a Virginia-based company that offered a technology called DNA phenotyping. Instead of searching for a direct match, phenotyping looks at certain genetic markers to predict visible characteristics, things like ancestry, skin tone, eye color, hair color, and the likelihood of freckles. It's important to understand, though, that this doesn't create an exact photograph of someone's face. It produces a probability-based estimate of what that person may look like based on the traits found in their DNA. In this case, the results suggested April's killer was a fair-skinned man of European ancestry with brown or black hair and hazel or green eyes. Then, using that information, the lab created a digital composite of what the killer may have looked like around the time of April's murder. From there, an age-progressed version was later released, showing what he might look like decades later. The new images generally lined up with the original witness description from 1988, but no one recognized him. Once again, investigators had learned more about April's killer without actually learning his name. Then, in April 2018, everything changed. Police in California announced the arrest of the suspected Golden State Killer, a man who had avoided identification for more than 4 decades. They had identified him using a relatively new technique called forensic genetic genealogy, a topic we've covered in dozens of past episodes. Then just over 2 weeks later, detectives in Fort Wayne decided to try the same approach in April's case. On May 11th, 2018, Detective Brian Martin arranged for the lab to conduct genetic genealogy testing on the DNA from April's killer. Now, this works differently from the national databases. Those compare a DNA profile against profiles taken from known offenders, arrestees, and other crime scenes. But if the person has never had his DNA entered into the system, there may be nothing there to match. But genealogy databases can identify relatives, even distant ones. At the time, people who had tested through consumer companies like Ancestry could download their raw DNA data and voluntarily upload it to public websites. That allowed them to compare their DNA with other users and potentially find relatives. So investigators converted the killer's DNA into the same type of profile used for those comparisons and uploaded it to one of them under the policies in place at the time. Within only about 8 hours, the database returned 12 potential relatives. But these weren't exactly close family members. Most appeared to be somewhere between third and fifth cousins. So the website didn't simply reveal the killer's name. It gave genetic genealogist C.C. Moore 12 distant pieces of a very large family puzzle. Moore began working backward, researching those matches until she identified the ancestors they shared with the unknown killer. Then she reversed direction and worked forward through each generation, using census records, obituaries, marriage records, birth announcements, newspapers, yearbooks, and social media. The resulting family trees included thousands of people. Slowly but surely, Moore found one branch of the family that had moved to Indiana. That branch eventually led her to a couple whose surviving sons fit the killer's likely age, sex, and location. By July 2nd, she had narrowed the possibilities down to 2 brothers living near Fort Wayne, and one of those brothers was 59-year-old John Miller. Miller lived alone in a trailer in Graybill, about 16 miles northeast of Fort Wayne. He had reportedly lived there since he was 19 and was known as a quiet, reclusive man who rarely interacted with his neighbors. He had never appeared on investigators' list of more than 700 potential suspects. To make sure they had the right guy, the police began surveillance outside his trailer home at the Graybill Mobile Home Park. But because he rarely went outside, the police had a hard time finding anything that might contain his DNA. But eventually, Miller rolled his trash bin out to the curb. Once garbage has been left outside for collection, it's generally considered abandoned, meaning police can legally take it without obtaining a search warrant. So on July 9th, investigators retrieved Miller's trash and began searching through it. Inside, they found exactly what they needed: 3 used condoms. They were sent to the Indiana State Police lab, where scientists compared the DNA inside them to the male profile recovered from April's underwear and the condoms left with the threatening letters in 2004. Then 3 days later, there was a perfect match. After 30 years, investigators finally knew the name of April Tinsley's killer, John Miller. And just in case you're wondering, he also looked strikingly similar to the sketch that Parabon Nanolabs had created. On Sunday, July 15th, 2018, 2 detectives approached Miller outside his trailer and asked if he would come with them to Fort Wayne to answer a few questions, and he agreed. During the 20-minute drive, he seemed completely relaxed. He made small talk with the detectives and chatted about television shows he liked to watch. If he suspected they already knew what he had done, he didn't show it. Once they arrived at the police station, he was taken into an interview room and read his rights. The detectives told him they had been working on an old case and that his name had recently come up. Then they asked if he had any idea what they wanted to speak with him about. After only a few moments, Miller said he thought it was probably the Tinsley case. The detectives had never mentioned April's name. When they asked why he thought that, Miller gave them a one-word answer: DNA. At that point, they told Miller they wanted him to explain what had happened in 1988. And at first, he said he couldn't. But after a little encouragement, he began to confess to everything. He said that on April 1st, 1988, he had driven into Fort Wayne specifically looking for a child to abduct. He had never met April before, but had simply seen her walking alone along Hoagland Avenue and decided to target her. According to Miller, he pulled ahead of her and waited for her to approach. He then threatened her with a sharp letter opener and forced her into his car. And this finally cleared up one of the biggest inconsistencies in the original investigation. The witness believed April had been taken in a blue pickup truck, but Miller said he was actually driving a blue Mercury Lynx, a small sedan. From there, he drove April back to the same trailer where he was still living 30 years later. He admitted that he assaulted her and then strangled her because he was afraid she would tell someone what he had done. Later that night, he drove to County Road 68 and left April's body in the ditch. The following day, he noticed that one of her shoes was still inside his car. So he drove past the area again and tossed it out near where he had left her. He also admitted that he had written the message on the barn in 1990 and left the threatening letters for young girls in 2004. He told investigators that he had considered abducting another child and had spent time watching neighborhoods and parking lots, but claimed he never found another opportunity. For 30 long years, Miller had continued living quietly in the same community. He stayed in the same trailer, worked overnight shifts, and mostly kept to himself. No one had ever reported him as a possible suspect. But on July 15th, 2018, the man who had avoided investigators for 3 decades finally admitted that he had kidnapped and murdered April Tinsley. Like every criminal defendant, Miller could have taken his case to trial, but instead, he accepted a plea deal from prosecutors and was sentenced to 80 years in prison. He likely knew the forensic evidence was strong enough to secure a conviction. Miller's deal with prosecutors meant that the death penalty was taken off the table, and he wouldn't be eligible for parole until at least July 2058, just days after what would have been his 99th birthday. But he wouldn't make it. On September 4th, 2025, John Miller died at the age of 66 of natural causes at St. Vincent Indianapolis Hospital. April's case wasn't solved because investigators suddenly discovered some new piece of evidence 30 years later. The forensic evidence had been there from the very beginning. For decades, John Miller repeatedly told investigators that he had killed April. He wrote it on a barn. He included it in letters. He even intentionally left behind his own DNA, apparently convinced that police would never be able to connect it to his name. But while Miller remained the same, forensic science did not. And today, Fort Wayne has made sure that John Miller is not the only name remembered from this case. April's garden was created in the neighborhood where she once lived and played. A pink magnolia tree and memorial bench were also dedicated to her at Fairfield Elementary School. They serve as reminders of April Marie Tinsley, not simply as the victim at the center of a famous cold case, but as the cheerful, shy 8-year-old girl whose name and memory ultimately proved far more enduring than the man who took her life. To share your thoughts on this week's story, be sure to follow us on social media at Forensic Tales. And if you want to listen to new episodes early and ad-free, consider signing up for our Patreon at patreon.com/Forensic Tales. You can get early ad-free access to new episodes and monthly full-length bonus episodes for as little as $3 a month. Your support on Patreon directly helps to fund the show's production, research, and editing costs. And as an independent one-woman podcast, your support truly helps to keep this show going. Forensic Tales is a Rockefeller audio production. The show is written and produced by me, Courtney Fretwell. If you'd like to support the show and help fund research, production, and editing, you can do so with a small monthly contribution on Patreon. Patreon supporters get early access to ad-free episodes and exclusive bonus content. You can learn more at patreon.com/Forensic Tales. And if you enjoy the show, leaving a positive rating or review really helps others discover it. For a full list of sources used in this episode, visit forensictales.com. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you next week. Until then, remember, not all stories have happy endings.
Meet Keith, loving dad, board game champ, bus driving pro.
I drive 65,000 miles in my bus each year. If people knew what I know, lives could be saved. Like how there are some things I simply can't see. On my route the other day, a car tried to sneak past me and ends up right in my blind spot. I turned slowly, so accident avoided. But no car should be in the blind spot for a 40,000-pound bus. It's our roads. It's our safety.
Visit www.sharetheroadsafely.gov.
If you like the show, please take a moment to rate, review, and subscribe. It really does help the show to grow. Thank you for listening.